Three. Okay, we have gone live. So essentially, I've got Abe Perlstein here from Los Osos in California, and he, I would consider one of the ancient ones in stereoscopic. So what you see on the screen here are some of his images, and what I'm going to do is kind of talk over them a little bit and kind of ask Abe, why don't you kind of talk about yourself? What's your name? Where do you live? What do you do for a living? So go ahead.
Well, actually, you already know my name. It's Abe Perlstein. Abram is my full name. I'm originally from Connecticut. I moved to California in 1980 to pursue my calling in the film industry. I started off as a camera assistant, but quickly grew tired of lugging around 60, 70-pound magazines of film. And then I realized my calling really was photography. I'd always done photography. My dad handed me a camera when I was 5. I had a Brownie camera. Remember the waist level finder Brownies? I didn't get into 3D until 1991, but from 1980 to 2000, I was a motion picture, television, and music industry photographer. And I have since relocated to the California Central Coast, where I've been pursuing my personal work, namely stereo landscapes, wildlife, portraiture, wildflowers, and architecture.
Okay, sounds great. So what was your influence? You know, obviously this has been a passion for many years. What has your influence been as far as moving in this direction and working in the 3D realm?
I'm glad you asked me that, because until 1991, aside from having seen a handful of 3D films, and I used to, when I was a kid, I got a Viewmaster set. I had an original Bakelite Viewmaster, and there were about 20 or 30 reels. I still have these reels. I'd go looking at them. They were always fantastical. I couldn't believe they were actually real. And forever, I wanted to know, can I create something like that? 1991, after 10 years of this little piece of paper stuck on my bulletin board that said, Stereo Club meeting every Thursday, third Thursday of the month. Wow, I'd love to go to a place where people are talking about stereos. I happen to be an audiophile. I wasn't thinking stereo photography. I go to this first meeting. There's mostly men in their 60s and above, a handful of younger people. And I'm looking around for the stereos. There's no stereos. However, there is a realist projector in the center of the room. The lights went down as soon as I walked in. They gave me a pair of glasses. I didn't know what they were for. I sat down, and from that moment on, my life changed, because I saw photography at that time, which was shot on transparency film, that was fantastical beyond anything I'd ever imagined before. And these people had shot it. Since that time, the level of photography and art has really gone up quite a bit, especially with the advent of digital workflows and presentations. But that 1991 night changed my life, and I began shooting 3D photography ever since. And I've done quite a bit of 3D video as well.
So you mentioned that you do video, and when I went out to your website or your blog site, it had a little bit of a history about you. You've also worked in the film industry, and as we know, over the last, what was it, 10 years, maybe in the last 5 years, probably when Avatar became big, that's when stereoscopic movies became big as well. And the reason I use the word stereoscopic and not 3D is, you know, I do a lot of 3D stuff, 3D tangible printing of objects, as well as scanning, and also do a lot of 3D design. And it's really two different areas. I think of it as looking or taking a 3D object and utilizing our stereoscopic vision in order to see it with depth or in a 3D space. And we're going to get into a little bit about VR, which is very similar to that as well. So what kind of movies have you worked on? Because I know you've done a few. You want to talk about that a little bit?
My movie credits as a stills photographer are approximately 120, and almost exactly the amount for television production. So I was the gentleman who was on set shooting alongside the camera crew, or I was shooting special photography, like poster shots, like magazine covers, video box covers, and so on. But generally I was on set, and I also did a lot of specials where I would go off the set and set something up with my own lighting for a poster and what have you. So Actually, you can't see it here because the camera's pointed towards me, but there is a poster in the back of the room. It's Reanimator. That was my very first feature film as a photographer. And I shot a lot of, it's funny because that was the first film. I shot a lot of horror films. I just got pigeonholed right after I started that. And then I started working in action films.
Well, let's kind of go back a moment. You said horror films, but isn't that kind of where the 3D or stereoscopic effect was probably used the most at that time to provide that extra thrill in the theater? And if I remember some of the advertising, it'll come out and get you. So
That's
that
true.
kind of makes sense.
Yeah, that's true. 3D and horror go hand in hand. In fact, this weekend, although I'm probably not going to be able to make it, they are premiering Hack and Jack versus the Chainsaw Queen, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember if I got the title right. It's a tribute to the old 3D horror films, except it's done with native 3D versus conversions, which I'm not a big fan of. And so even though none of the films I worked on were 3D until later in my career, I just love seeing 3D. I'd go out of my way to see a 3D film, even when they weren't popular in the theaters, because there were a number of revivals of 3D films, often in two-strip polarized presentations. Anaglyph, as good as it is for certain things, which is red and blue or red and cyan glasses, has never been my preferred mode of
No, and I don't think for most people, but as you mentioned, it's easy to do, easy to separate, and easy to create very cheap glasses. But we'll talk about the different types in a moment. So you've had let's say an illustrious, but a varied background in film.
Yeah.
But your specialty is really static images. And one of the things that we've talked about in the past is that there really hasn't been a platform that really shows off good stereographic photography. And as you mentioned, in fact, you have a viewfinder. Is that, you want to go ahead and bring it up into the shot? So essentially, in my opinion, and in yours, I believe as well, stereoscopic viewing needs to be done with these type of viewers. And if I remember, what was the old thing that the kids had? The
Viewmaster.
The Viewmaster was a similar process, except obviously a smaller slide film. I don't remember what it is. I'm thinking it's probably like 110.
Actually, the size of a
now that's a 35, if I remember correctly.
The size of a Viewmaster image is about that corner of the square. Okay. So it's about a sixth the size of a 35 millimeter shot. And, the resolution is not as good, and it looks like you're looking down a long tube when you're looking to a Viewmaster. But the great thing about 35 millimeter size images is the resolution is phenomenal. Most of the work that I've been doing has been either projected, so people are sitting in a theatrically presentation with polarized glasses, or it's starting to appear on auto stereoscopic glasses-free displays, which I'm a huge fan
lenticular.
of. Not necessarily lenticular only, but that's one type. There are many other types, and there is Apple's been threatening to come out with their 3D smartphone, and now I just read somewhere where it's not going to be 3D in a visual sense. It's going to be 3D in a shooting sense. I'm just very unclear as to what they're doing.
And actually, we can talk about that a little bit if you'd like.
Sure.
Since I, as I mentioned, work more in the tangible 3D area and work specifically with a lot of scanners. In fact, I've designed a few products, which we're going to actually do when we get done with the interview, which is 3D Scan You. Apple bought the company called PrimeSense. I don't know if you've heard of that. And they create the sensor that I have been working with, which is the occipital structure sensor. And when you make that comment, it makes a lot of sense. Since they bought them, obviously they bought the technology and the intellectual property to do that kind of 3D sensing. And it's small enough now that they could build it into an iPad or even one of their larger phones. Now, as you know, they've grown in size back since the 5S. So I can see that happening. And also Dell is using a product by Intel, which also provides depth mapping, which is the 3D component. And so we're going to be seeing that a lot more. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. And, maybe we'll talk about it after the interview, but there's some pitfalls in that area. And I've worked with it enough now to realize that that's not the holy grail as well, as you probably are aware of. So getting back to stereoscopic, you mentioned the viewers, and that's really the best way to view it. And you mentioned you do projection. Now, normally when I've seen projectors in the past, you had to wear the anaglyph glasses, but that's not what you're talking about, right?
No, I'm talking specifically polarized projection, either circular or linear, but mostly circular
Okay.
polarized.
And that's what you're seeing in the film theaters today, right?
Yeah, mostly circular, although there are variations on a theme. But the Real D system and the other systems are generally circular polarized, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
I've never been a highly technical guy. I'm really a visual artist. I'm the kind of guy that when he gets into an automobile, he turns the ignition, he drives. He doesn't really care how the engine works, as long as it gets him from one place to another. I look at photography the very same way. I'm not very technical. I'm fairly good at what I do because I have a grasp of the visual sense of it. But when it comes to the technical things, sometimes it gives me a little bit of a challenge, to say the least, especially now with the new digital workflows. And this is what I've discovered. Before, when I was working in film, stills, as well as video, I was working with a projected medium or a film medium. I'm looking at a film image. I'm not looking at an electronic image. My eyes don't get fatigued looking at those images. However, my eyes and many other people who work in this industry get very fatigued looking at an electronic image. And so they're limited to how much they can do.
Now, what do you mean by
an
electronic image?
I mean a computer screen.
Okay.
I mean a tablet. I mean a laptop. I mean a smartphone, especially a smartphone because it's so small and you're squinting to look at things. And the more you strain your eyes to look at something like that, the more, in my case, I start to lose the ability to actual focus. So I have to limit my use to not very much every day. So here's the odd thing, the juxtaposition. I'm spending 3 minutes to take a picture of something. Then I'm taking an hour to do the image processing on maybe just one or a couple of images because I'm sort of a perfectionist. I don't want to put something out there until it looks great. I hate looking back at something and saying, God, if I had just done this one little thing.
I know the feeling. So on that, I think what I'm going to do now is fade back into some of your images, and obviously you can't see them right now, but essentially what I've got now is a flock of birds, black and white.
Well, that's an interesting image. I'll tell you a little bit about that.
Okay.
Are there some seals down at the bottom there?
There are.
For a number of years, well, number of months rather, 15 months to be exact, I created, produced, and shot the Morro Bay National Estuary Stereo Photo Survey.
I've seen it. It's still on display.
It's still on display at the Morro Bay Nature Center. There's a cabinet of 6 images at a time that are rear lit by a full spectrum lighting source. And so I went out in a boat. And in fact, if you want to switch back to me, I can show you the actual gear that I shot with. This is just one of many configurations of the gear. These are two Nikon, I almost said Canon. These are two Nikon F5.
That's a full frame, right?
It's full frame, but it's film. And this is two 24 to 85 millimeter lenses, and I have a 70 to 300. This camera system was able to get those shots you see at the birds and what have you. I'm in a kayak. I'm hand holding this 20-pound behemoth. I am focusing 2 lenses. I am setting the f-stops on 2 lenses. I'm setting the shutter speed on 2 lenses.
You're doing this all manually.
I have to do it all manually. There just really isn't another way to do it.
So let's go into a little detail after you describe the shot, and then about why you have to use manual control. A lot of people may have seen these what would you call it, these all-in-one cameras, or even the cell phone with the 3D, but there's really a lot more to that. So why don't you go ahead and finish up what you were saying? Sorry for interrupting you, and then kind of talk about that.
That's okay. The reason it has to be all manual is because there just really isn't anybody creating a system right now that will take an off-the-shelf DSLR or even a mirrorless camera and create a system where one camera is slaved to the other's functions. Aside from shutter triggering from one camera to the next, which can be done very well with single images. Can't shoot like, can't do that because they'll go out of sync immediately. But for single images, you can get really good synchronization. And my support network was Nikon Professional Services to get this together. An incredible technician down in Torrance, California named Dean Pham. you have to do manual control, because otherwise you don't, if you
Now
tell
you're
the camera,
talking manual control on both cameras, correct?
that's correct.
So sometimes you could have different settings. Or do you try?
No, you would never get different settings. You want to try to remember to keep the same settings. So in
you
the
probably
middle
have a
of a
checklist.
high action, yeah, there's always a checklist. In the middle of shooting birds that are, let's say they're 60 feet away,
Mm-hmm.
and they're coming by me. I don't really have a lot of time. I set my shutter speed on one camera, shutter speed on the other, f-stop on one camera, f-stop on the other camera, focus on one, focus on the other, zoom on one, zoom on the other. Then I've lost the shot. So my ratio of actually achieving good shots was about 2 in every 10. And I was shooting film, so I was wasting a lot of film. But those 2 out of the every 10, some of which you were seeing there, they're amazing, because no one really had ever shot anything like that before on a regular basis. I did it for a year and a half. And the idea was to show the environments, the life forms, the light, the different aspects of what an estuary is. A lot of people, when you say, I live next to an estuary, they say, what's that? They actually don't know what it is. So this is designed to help them learn through the exhibit that's on the waterfront in Morro Bay.
Well, that's, obviously that's very important, and it also provides a very life experience that they would otherwise not get. So, we talked a little bit about the technical sides of it. Can you kind of give us a little bit of a theory? You said you're not a technical guy, but obviously you need to understand how the eyes work. So kind of, obviously there's a reason we have two eyes, and but there's an importance, the distance, and you probably know all
Yeah.
the terms for that.
There's a basic formula. I loosely ascribe to this formula. It's called the 1 in 30 rule. For every 30 inches something is away from your camera or from your lens, you move 1 inch from left to right. And then the two cameras are 2 inches away. Let's say if something is 5 or 5.5 feet away. So the further something is away, and that's the first thing that you see in the stereo window, which is it's like looking through a window.
Mm-hmm.
Everything goes into the window. Sometimes things come through the window in unusual circumstances, like when you have a shot of a bird flying at you. But for the most part, things go into the window. So you have to gauge how far the cameras need to be apart. So let's say I'm shooting with this camera system. I'm in a boat. Well, now there's something a little farther away. I'm not going to get any depth, so I have to move the cameras apart. Can you see that?
Okay, actually, I was looking at your images, but I'm back.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
So you have to
So
adjust.
so essentially, and that's one of the reasons why you have a sliding bar.
Right.
The further the object, the further the cameras need to be apart.
Yeah, because without the camera separation, without the left and right eye separation, you don't get depth. So the more you separate the two cameras, let's say I'm known for doing hyper stereo shots.
And that's what you would call when you have a longer, what would you call
longer
it?
stereo base
Mhm.
or wider stereo base.
Okay.
And so let's say, well, I don't have the image in this group, but one of the images that I shot is of a kiteboarder shot from the north end of Morro Bay, and he's about 1/3 of the way towards Morro Rock, which is pretty much about a half a mile from my two cameras. It took me about an hour to set up the cameras. I wasn't expecting the man in the kiteboarder. I was just going to get this beautiful beach with the waves rolling in, looking to Morro Rock and what's behind it. So I set my cameras up, 2 cameras on a tripod with a radio control, Mamiya wireless controller. It's a radio controller. And they're about 45 feet apart. The cameras are very, very accurately aimed, so they look the same in both camera eyepieces. And then one camera is triggered by the other camera. And just as I lined everything up, here comes the kiteboarder. Amazing. It was a great shot without the kiteboarder, but with the kiteboarder, especially because he just really stood out from everything else. But he's tiny. He looks like a tiny little miniature, action figure. Doesn't look like a human.
Yeah, there's a term for that where you
Miniaturization.
or a diorama, or there's a term that's used in Photoshop for creating that kind of effect, but I can't think of it right now.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I'm talking about.
I do know what you're talking about, and I will remember it when I don't think about it.
Yeah, that's what I do. Okay, so essentially, in your case, you want to use hyper distances in order to capture something that do you normally see that with your eyes,
No, you're
or
unable to see that
okay?
with your eyes. In
So
fact,
this
in that grouping of slides, I don't know if you can go to that, Mike.
I can.
There's one cloud shot in there.
Okay,
There's an aerial shot of clouds. That was shot with a single camera.
let's see if I can
One of my
quickly zip through some of
one of
these.
my favorite things is shooting clouds from just commercial airliners with the rare clean window that you get without the wing in the shot. And in this case, the stereo base was probably about half a mile, I'm guessing, maybe even a little more. And so you get to see a lot of depth throughout the entire image. You can't see that from the airplane. I mean, you can see the clouds moving by, but you can't really see it all in one because your eyes are only 2.5 inches apart on average.
Okay, so I've got a scene where there are dunes or sand in the front, and then there's some cloud covering the back.
No, it's
Okay.
just clouds. It's an
Yeah.
aerial shot in a cloud grouping of clouds. There's the only one in there. Maybe look at it in the thumbnail sketches. Maybe it'll be easier to
Well,
find.
with this particular application, all I can do is move back and forth
Oh, okay.
in a sequence, so I apologize for that.
Oh, that's all right. Maybe you'll find it.
Well, but in speaking of the one that does have some cloud coverage in the back, I'm assuming that it would probably be similar. Let's see if I can drop back to it.
And actually, the majority of what I shoot now is with single camera. I've always shot with a single camera.
So that's another important thing. You were showing me a dual camera setup, but you can also do this with just one camera, right?
Yes, I'm going to step up on a way and just show you the camera I've been using. It's one of the higher end Canon point and shoots. This is a G12. It's a G12. The G15, G16, G1X, they're all
very similar.
They're all similar, except they keep getting better. And as soon as you get one that's really good, the next one's better, and that one's obsolete. This one still takes great shots. It's not good with low light. It's good with good strong light. But I'm very good at doing handheld shots. So I take a left shot and I take a right shot, and that's a 3D shot.
Yep.
And the shot of the dunes that you saw, that was shot that way.
Oh, was it?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Anything that doesn't have action in it, I often shoot it.
Now they make, and in fact, I've got one. They've got sliding bars where you mount it and then you just slide it, and you can actually measure out. In fact, there's a scale on mine so that you know the distances. So like you said, if you have notes and figure out your distance, you can literally slide it across there, and you can get away with one camera. However, when you're doing video, obviously one camera won't work for you. Am I correct?
Well, you can work with one camera with an attachment. There are attachments that will use a standard video
using
camera.
a prism or splitting it.
Or exactly.
But then you lose the resolution.
You do lose the resolution, or you use the aspect ratio. I'd much rather get professional quality video the right way the first time than try to hack into it, which is what happens when you do that.
You know, in the movie now, in the theater right now, or actually it's coming out very soon, is the Hobbit movie, which was done with, I believe, two red cameras, but they had multiple setups, and they were also shot in 48 frames per second. Do you want to kind of elaborate a little bit on that? Now, this is video, 2 cameras, obviously red cameras.
Well, we're talking Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson is a big fan of S3D, stereo 3D, native 3D. That's not to say there's not a lot of special effects that are generated to be looking like they are part of the scene, even though they weren't actually there at all. It's against a green screen or what have you. But he's a big fan of as James Cameron is, of stereo 3D,
right,
to just start off from the right. And I want to say this just as an aside, I really loathe conversions of two-dimensional.
What do you mean by conversions?
A 2D to 3D stereoscopic conversion. Some of them are done very, very good, but the majority of them that come out, even the newer ones, they're just not very good because they're done really just to make money.
And from what I've read about the technical perspective, they literally will cut out, let's say, the main subject from the background scene, and then either fill in the background scene or use some other techniques to provide that stereo image, because then they separate the foreground image into the stereoscopic, and then the background normally stays on the single plane to give you that pop. And as you said, it's not realistic. It's not done properly.
It ends up looking like planes of depth. Like multiple planes of depth, sometimes not very many, but in the real world, everything's rounded. Mm-hmm. It's not flat things that are stacked up against each other. And although they're getting better and better and better, and in fact, a great example, even though it's 2 years old now, James Cameron's conversion of Titanic was astounding.
Hmm.
It looked like it was shot in 3D. There were only a couple of shots that
Now,
didn't work.
part of the reason I think that might have worked as well, from what I've read, is that some of those were 3D shots or 3D rendered shots that they'd done before. Now, when you can use 3D, you can use virtual cameras.
This is true.
So you split the cameras properly and then you shoot the frames. And that's probably one of the reasons it looked realistic, and probably why some machines, especially live shots, didn't, or especially if they were composited. So I have a feeling that may have been the reason that they may have looked better. But I agree with you. And normally they don't tell you when you're looking at the advertisement that it was converted. So do a little research before you actually go see a movie.
Well, here's the thing. You are paying a fee to see a 3D film in the theater, an added additional fee, an added value fee, except you're going in to see a film that's not actually good in the first place, and then you're paying extra to see it in 3D. What's wrong with this picture? That's a great way to turn off the entire audience to 3D.
Hasn't that happened?
It's been happening over and over again. That is why 3D is largely fading away from the three-dimensional television broadcasts, because it just hasn't really caught on, because it's hard to say this. I'm really opinionated in this, I admit. But to me, you have to make something, and you're making something in 3D because it has something to do with the story. It's going to further the story. Just the fact that it's in 3D doesn't make it better. In some ways, it'll make it worse, because it's accentuating things that don't look right or don't feel right. Just
like
because it's in 3D does not make it better. And so I'm actually not alone. Some of my other peers have said, why don't you do away with the 3D fee? Just have people go to the film. If it's good and they like it, they're going to go. But you're already turning them off with the extra fee. It's really tough when you're a family.
Wasn't the justification for that you required a different type of projector? In fact, in some cases, let's see, either it's Prism or two cameras, or I'm sorry, two projectors with different filters, or they use some type of alternating frame sequence with two different filters. But it's an extra cost, and that's at least what they've been saying, plus the cost of actually creating it. But like you said, if they're just running it through let's call it a black box, where a 2D, and they run a few equations and then out comes 3D, that's not very good. That's just turning a profit. And there has been many articles where a lot of people were turned off. And the other thing, you were talking about TVs in the home. I think part of the problem there is it just frankly isn't that good. Either you have to wear the LCD shutter type glasses, which are heavy, and you have the flicker, or you can use the type of screens that have the polarization built into them, but you lose half of your, probably in most cases, the vertical resolution.
Yes, but this is changing rapidly, because
Agreed, we're getting higher resolution 4Ks coming out, and from what I've heard, there's a good podcast on home stereo. He's a guru, and he really likes what's coming out with the new 4Ks. With the 4Ks, you don't see that anymore, and it looks just as good as in the theaters.
That's correct. The polarized 4Ks.
Correct.
The auto stereo TVs, they just don't. The technology is still not there. Great, you don't need glasses, but
you have a limited view.
Well, you have a limited clarity. It's usually mostly things that are in the foreground that are sharp, even in the original movie. Although everything in the background can be sharp, not in an auto stereo setup. And there's very few people that are adopting this, because they cost somewhere upwards of 5 or 6 times more for one of those than just getting a 3D TV with polarized glasses, which, by the way, are very light. And the electronic glasses, which used to be heavy, are getting lighter and lighter. The advantage of having electronic glasses is that you generally can get a little off axis, from what I understand. I can't remember.
Which ones again?
Off axis to the screen.
You're talking about the the polarized glasses?
I'm talking the electronic field sequential glasses. The polarized glasses,
there's a sweet spot.
You can't really view in a bright room. You can't. It's the nature of the beast. So there's pluses and minuses for everything, but the main thing that's driving it out of the home is the fact that there's really only This is the only kind of, the content that is available is this. You've got regurgitated, and I say that with all the love I can, Hollywood feature films on Blu-ray mostly. You can download things, but because the data is so intensive of downloading something, a lot of people are still going for Blu-rays. Blu-rays are still very popular for 3D. You did have things like movies on the cable channels. You also had sports. ESPN had a lot of sports. They have eliminated their sports in 3D. And oddly enough, they were actually doing it pretty good. I don't know why they stopped. I don't know. Maybe the advertisers weren't there. I don't know what became of that. Now you have a burgeoning adult industry. Most of that is just crap. I don't care if it's adult or whatever it is. It's just not shot right. It's not good to watch. Again, because it's in 3D doesn't make it better. Then you have a lot of stuff on YouTube, which is amateur uploaded content. This is shot with, this is not a off-the-shelf thing. This is a combination of off-the-shelf stuff. But people shoot a lot of 3D with cameras that are either video or stills or a combination thereof. And they upload it. It's just, again, it's there. It's not necessarily very good. And that's pretty much all you have a selection of. There are now a handful of websites that have professional looking content that are designed for all the different formats. So you have auto stereoscopic tablets, laptops, smartphones.
Okay.
And
you'll provide me these links so that I can add them in the show notes.
I'll try. I'm not sure if I can. I'm not really up to date.
Let's segue into something that really is starting to take off. And I don't know your input on it, but it's not going to deter me because I think this is where the future is, and that's VR. I think Oculus Rift has hit it out of the park, and it's just getting better and better. You may have seen the DK1. Of course, it was only a 720p screen. In fact, if you remember, it's split into two for left and right. So you're like 600 pixels per eye. That's bad.
Although it looks not so bad because it's so close.
Well, but even so, you can see the pixel.
Yes.
And I guess I'm a stickler for that. But then they put out the DK2, which we're going to try after this interview, so that you'll get an idea. This is an organic LED, and we've talked about that a lot, an OELED. So it has better persistence, better blacks, and if I remember correctly, they're using a Samsung screen, so you don't have, and I can't think of the term now, so they actually use a true RGB. So you've got good impact, good wow, and more importantly, it's a 1080p screen. And then what I'm thinking is going to happen is I think it's pretty close, and the rumors that when they release this in November, it will actually be a 4K screen or 3850, 3860, something like that. The next 1980 or 1920 plus, what is that? I can't do the math right now.
And just so you'll know, they're not the only ones in the game. There are 3 or 4 other manufacturers that are coming out with something that is almost identical.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a moment. But the point is, they started it, well, they didn't start it. I've got some glasses from way back when, but they've made it cheap. You can buy the developer's kit right now, the DK2, for about $350.
Is that the cardboard version?
No, that's the actual DK2.
Okay.
Now, the cardboard is another thing. We'll get into that in a moment. But the whole point is, now you have the ability, and it separates into both left and right. And as the screen gets better, we now take away that component where we're now getting the density that is, not say close to 35 millimeter, but at least stereo, the little 110 equivalent. But more importantly, full 360. So you've got your stereoscopic, but then you can move your head around. So you're now in the middle of whatever the event is. So have you played around? I mean, you mentioned you do panoramics. Have you done stereographic panoramic, or is it even necessary if you do a full panoramic? I'm thinking that from my experience, you can probably use a little bit of math to come out with, because since you have to move around in a panoramic scene, you've got your stereo images there. So have you played with that or toyed with that?
Well, I have a few colleagues that have done that. It's way beyond my skill set. And most of them are doing things that are approaching 140, 150 degrees from left to right. Not necessarily all horizontal format, but some vertical format
portrait.
Going from left to right. So creating a 360 degree, that's a tough thing to accomplish.
But you know, they've got some new technology out there where they're using HD equivalent cameras, smaller ones. Obviously, you don't have the optic, but putting them in an orb, and the audience can see me on, let's see, use the right hand, in an orb. and then you can put that on a tripod or on the underbelly of a quadcopter, and then have full 360. And they're out there right now, and then you can view them. I don't have one to show you later on, but
I've
maybe I'll
seen
later.
pictures of these things,
Mhm.
but again, when you're shooting 360, you're always going to get the shooting device in the shot. How can you avoid that?
Um, there are tricks, just like our own eyes,
Yeah,
where you use, well, it's kind of some algorithms to fill in that hole, just like we have in
right.
our own eye.
Okay.
So that's what's happening. But the other point is, if you're at the center, we can't see the interior of our own head,
Hmm.
so you're still on that pivot pole. The point is, it's very thin, and then it encompasses, so you're only losing maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 inches.
Can I give you my feeling on Oculus Rift
Sure.
or any of those? There's 3 or 4 others that are coming out. My feeling is that it's really great for certain things. One thing that I think it's really great is for therapy. For someone that's really stressed out, and this is something that I've been working on developing with a few of my colleagues. When people are stressed out, they've gone through some trauma, and it's not necessarily Oculus Rift, but it's just anything that's just a 3D image that's calming, along with the accompanying sound that's binaural sound. Binaural sound is 360-degree spherical sound versus just left and right
Hmm.
stereo. And it puts you in a certain state of mind. It's also great for learning. If you want to learn about something, let's say you want to learn how to do a craft, or it's an instructional film, or an educational film, or an industrial film. You're trained to work on a piece of equipment, and you have to know exactly how this thing goes together. What better a way to learn it than in 3D? It's never about 3D, in my estimation. It's never about 3D. It's about good content that is better presented in 3D, or shot and presented in 3D. So
Well,
I actually welcome it.
good.
Uh, the only thing that I'm a little concerned about are having those electronics on my head or on
We
anyone's head.
talked about that a little bit, and I don't want to get into the debate here, but I did some research on it, and one of the things that they do is they put a polarized plate in front of it. It's very thin, you can microscopic, that is used to prevent some of the higher, and we can't call it RF emissions. Plus, if you're not using a cell phone and it's just running through umbilical cords that we've seen earlier, your emissions aren't anywhere near a cell technology. And, again, that's important. I think that more studies need to be done, obviously, in that whole range. And again, I'm not going to debate it, but I don't think there's
It's
enough studies being done, and
right.
we need to do more about it. But I don't think it's the same thing. And, we kind of talked about other people getting into this. As you're probably aware of, Samsung now just came out with their Samsung Gear VR, which literally is just a plastic goggle set that you put your Note 4 into, and then you have a VR system. The important thing behind that is that the Oculus Rift was behind it. They actually provide the SDK. You can go download it if you're a developer, and it has some interesting aspects. And you mentioned also Google Cardboard, which I have a version that was made in Germany that's kind of out of a hard foam rubber that works very similar to that. I played with it a little. It's cool because there's no wires. So you can literally stand somewhere and look around you like you're in that environment. Uh, I have only a Galaxy S4, so I only have a 1080p screen. But I think with the Note 4, or even next year, with the higher resolution 4K screens, it, as you said, is going to be, you could go to a museum. And with having something mobile and possibly some tracking, maybe outdoors with GPS, finer GPS system, you could literally walk around in the museum. You probably fall on your head, but
Well, you
you can get
think?
a you can get a tracking mat or something. Somebody else is coming out with that, where
Yeah.
it's like a rolling system
Oh,
with shoes that you walk around with, but it moves you in the VR world.
yeah.
So you could literally get on one of those and walk around in a museum and think that you're there. And then I've been working with some new haptic gloves that you could actually touch things. So, my wife thinks I'm crazy because I think, why do you want to live in that world? Well, it provides opportunities for people.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a good thing, and I wasn't going to bring it up here, but I am actually working on a VR system for relaxation. My wife is a psychotherapist, but I'm thinking, you could have somebody lay down like they're on the beach or some other environment, and then have this disembodied voice, your therapist, talk to you while you're soothing you while you're in this environment. So that's the direction I'm going, but I was going to be working with high resolution gaming engines. So you actually create different environments
Hmm.
that are surrealistic. And so I'm,
Photographic looking, but
mhm,
actually not real.
exactly. And I have enough background that I think I could pull it out. So that is why I'm involved with it. And I think it's very cool. So we're kind of gone a little bit over time. We could probably talk forever on this, but one other area that I wanted to bring up, and you said you're not that technical, so um, I understand if you don't really know a lot about it,
Hmm.
but because we think or see in stereoscopic, some people have created 3D scanners that work off of that principle. And two come to mind. Artec, I don't know if you looked them up, but
No, not familiar with them.
Artec is a company that makes a $10,000 and a $20,000 scanner that works off of that. They use stereo imaging and light modulation in order to create I wouldn't say a distortion, but a deformation pattern on an object. And then they stitch that all together to create the 3D mesh. And then Fuel 3D has just come out with a product that works similar to that. But again, in both cases, it's stereoscopic. And if you look at them, you'll see the stereo imagers in there. And obviously it
Hmm.
makes sense. And they're coming out with a product that's $1,500. But the caveat behind their system is you have to wear a little wand on your body in order to use as a target to provide it to. And I think it's limited on what you can scan. So those are two that I'm aware of that are using stereoscopic imagers. So it can be done. The other important thing about 3D in the tangible world or 3D design is that once you have a tangible object, then you can create it as a display in stereo. So I'm seeing that happening more realistic objects in games. I think that's another area that the VR system. I mean, I'll give you a demo. I don't know if you're familiar with Half-Life 2, Half-Life 2.
I've heard of it. I've never
No?
played it.
Okay. Well, you might get an opportunity when we get done
Hmm.
here. Um, it
I'm
is one
actually,
thing,
I never play any games. I
and
like going out in the real world and soaking in nature. That's my thing.
well, eventually we're going to get to the point where you're not going to tell the difference, but that's a different story. However, I like the technology, obviously, and I pursue it, and I also pursue the 3D art perspective of it, and the gaming engines and their involvement in creating more and more realistic environments to work in. Well, Half-Life was not only a good game from a gaming perspective, but it created some very realistic, and obviously this was done 2003, so it's been almost 10 years now, but it still holds up pretty well.
Hmm.
And because the frame rate is pretty good, it works really well with the Oculus. But the point I want to make is it's one thing to look at a screen and play in a 3D world, but it's another to be actually in it, where you move around, you look at all the 3D objects, like there's a 3D screen in a game, you can literally go up to it. And that's where it has evolved. And I think there's still some issues with sickness because your body is disembodied and your feet aren't moving. And I think the body says, this isn't happening the right way.
Hmm.
So you
Hmm.
can't, until they get over it or you go through some training, disembodying yourself where your feet aren't moving when you're moving needs to be trained, or you have to get over that. So I still see it after a while, especially if I'm moving quickly. But to be able to move your head around a 3D gaming wall to shoot a bad guy in a game, or do something with one hand and still look like you do in a real world. Most gaming, you can't do that. You can either do one thing or another, but to be able to do two things, that to me that sold me. And again, limited quality in the screen, but I think that's the direction. So, on that note, if you want to close it for us and kind of identify if somebody wants to take this on themselves, what kind of tips can you give them? And then we'll close the show.
Wants to take on what?
Um, from an artist's perspective, photographer's perspective,
Oh, okay.
what is the best way to get a good 3D image? I mean, we've got plenty to show here and we've shown a few, but what do you think is the most important thing?
I think there's one word, and that's called experiment. There is no one size fits all for every person. And there's also a pretty big learning curve for some people, others not so much. For me, I'm still learning. I probably will never, ever learn everything that I need to know, even for what I'm already doing. But a lot of it is intuition. A lot of it is just having good timing, a good eye, and recognizing composition. You can do great stereo photography, native stereo photography, with a single camera, with non-moving subjects. That's a great way to start. I started that way, and actually I feel like I've returned to that way because it's a very organic thing. You have to do it right. If it's just slightly wrong, it doesn't work. But there are a lot of clubs around the world that help people. One of them is the LA 3D Club in Los Angeles. I belonged to that club since '91. It's a great group of people. And there is another national group called the National Stereoscopic Association, the International Stereoscopic Union, and Congress, rather. No, the International Stereoscopic Union. And there are many other local, when I say local, regional stereoscopic societies that help people like myself that would like to learn more.
Great. Well, thank you, Abe.
You're
This
welcome.
was really enjoyable. And as mentioned, we'll speak a little bit more afterwards, and you'll actually get to try the DK too.
All right.
So
Thank you.
on that note, this is Mike Balzer from All Things 3D, and this is with our interview with Abe Perlstein on what is today now, December 9th?
10th.
10th.
Yes.
10th, 2014. And I appreciate you listening. Thank you.